nobody called the ambulance. Not the woman in the blue coat who had been standing 3 feet away when it happened. Not the man in the hardware store doorway who had watched the whole thing from behind his coffee cup. Not the 2 teenagers on the bench across the street who had looked up from their phones for exactly 4 seconds and then looked back down. Not even the shift supervisor at the Petro-Canada on the corner, who had seen Maurice Pelletier collapse through the window and had picked up the phone and set it back down again because he was not sure it was his place to get involved. Route 17 eastbound. January 9th. A pharmacy worker's coat folded on the passenger seat of a pickup truck that she was about to give away and never get back. Annette Pelletier had been working the overnight shift at the Shoppers Drug Mart on Principale Street in Rivière-du-Loup for 11 years. 11 years of fluorescent light and the particular quiet that settles over a pharmacy at 2 in the morning, when the only people who come in are the ones who have run out of something they should have gotten earlier but could not afford to. Or the ones who have been up since midnight with a sick child and have finally admitted that the cough syrup in the cabinet at home is not going to be enough. She had started there at 41 after the mill closed. Not the big mill on the eastern edge of town. That one had closed 15 years before and most people had made their peace with it. The small one. The one that had opened in 2008 with promises of 40 jobs and had lasted 9 years before the contract with the paper company in Edmundston fell through, and the 40 jobs became no jobs on a Thursday afternoon in November with 3 weeks' notice and 2 months' severance, and a handshake from a manager who flew in from somewhere outside the province and flew back the same day. Her husband, Maurice, had worked at the mill for 7 of those 9 years. He had been 44 when it closed, old enough that the retraining programs felt designed for someone else. Young enough that retirement was not a conversation anyone in his family had ever been able to afford to have. He had found work eventually, driving a delivery truck for a building supply company out of Témiscouata-sur-le-Lac, 3 days a week at first, and then 4, and then 5 when the senior driver retired and nobody replaced him. The work was steady enough. It was not what he had known. But steadiness, when you have been without it, stops being a consolation and starts being the thing you organize your life around. Annette had taken the pharmacy job because it was there, and because nights were the only shift nobody else wanted, which meant she could get it without seniority. She had never worked in a pharmacy before. She learned it the way she had learned most things in her life, which was by paying attention to what the person who already knew was doing, and then doing it herself until she stopped making mistakes. She was not a pharmacist. She was a pharmacy assistant. The distinction mattered to the licensing board and to the people who designed the pay scale, and to almost nobody else who came in at 2 in the morning needing something for a fever that had been going on for 3 days. What Annette had, after 11 years of overnight shifts, was something the licensing board could not certify and the pay scale could not account for. She knew people, not by name, always, but by need. She knew which medications the elderly women on the north side of town were taking, and which ones they sometimes skipped, because the price had gone up again and they were trying to make the bottle last until the end of the month. She knew which young mothers came in exhausted and which ones came in frightened, and she knew the difference between those two things, because they were not the same thing at all, even though they looked similar from behind a counter at 2 in the morning. She had a habit she had developed in her 2nd year at the pharmacy and had never told anyone about. When a customer was short, not significantly short, just short, the kind of short that happens when you have counted your change 3 times and still come up $4 under. She paid the difference herself, not dramatically. She would tap the keypad as if there was some kind of system adjustment happening, some discount she was applying, some loyalty points being converted. She had gotten very good at making the transaction look routine. It was not routine. It cost her, over the course of a year, somewhere between $200 and $300. She did not track it. She did not want to know the number because knowing the number would require her to decide whether the number was acceptable, and she did not want to have that conversation with herself. She just did it the way she did most things, without announcement, without waiting to be asked, because the person on the other side of the counter needed the thing, and she was the person standing closest to it. Her daughter, José, knew about the habit. She had seen it happen once in her 3rd year of pharmacy school when she had come to visit and had walked in during a shift. She had watched her mother tap the keypad. She had not said anything until they were in the car afterward. She asked what that was. Annette said it was nothing. José said she had seen the screen. Annette was quiet for a moment. Then she said that the woman had been $4 short and had a child at home with an ear infection, and that $4 was $4. José looked at her. She said she was going to be a pharmacist in 7 months and was already calculating what $4 a transaction added up to over a year, and she wanted her mother to stop doing that. Annette said she would think about it. She did not stop. Maurice had been healthy for most of their marriage. Not athletically healthy, not the kind of health that gets noticed. He did not run, did not go to the gym, did not own a bicycle. He was healthy the way working men in their 50s are healthy. Which is to say, his body had organized itself around the work and had not yet started complaining loudly about the arrangement. He was 56 when the complaining started. It started as fatigue. The particular fatigue that is different from being tired after a long day, that is present before the day begins, that does not improve with sleep, that feels less like the absence of energy and more like the presence of something taking it. He did not mention it for 3 months, because mentioning it required a doctor's appointment, and a doctor's appointment required time off the delivery route, and time off the delivery route meant the stops did not get covered, and Maurice was not the kind of man who left stops uncovered. When he finally went, it was Annette who made the appointment. She had noticed the way he moved in the kitchen in the mornings. Not slower exactly, but more deliberate, as if each action required a moment of preparation that had not been required before. She noticed, and she said nothing for 2 weeks because she was afraid of what she was noticing, and being afraid of something did not make it go away. But it did sometimes delay the moment when you had to stop being afraid of it and start dealing with it. The appointment led to blood work. The blood work led to a referral. The referral led to a specialist in Rivière-du-Loup, and then another one in Quebec City, and eventually to a diagnosis that was not the worst thing it could have been, and was not anything close to a simple thing either. Type 2 diabetes, managed. A heart arrhythmia that needed monitoring, and something in his left knee that the orthopedic surgeon in Quebec City said was going to need surgery sooner rather than later, though sooner and later were both relative terms when you were on a provincial waiting list. The surgery came 14 months after the referral. By then, Maurice had been driving with the knee pain for over a year, compensating for it in small ways that the body finds without asking the brain for permission. He came home from the surgery and sat in the chair in the living room for 6 weeks while the knee healed. And during those 6 weeks, Annette worked the overnight shift and drove him to follow-up appointments during the day and slept when she could, which was not as much as she should have. He recovered. He went back to work. The route was waiting. The thing nobody told you about a family managing 2 health crises in 4 years, while one income was intermittent, was that it was not dramatic. It did not look like what it was. It looked, from the outside, like an ordinary life in an ordinary town with ordinary problems. And the people in it were tired in a way that did not show up on their faces because they had been tired for long enough that the face had stopped registering. Annette had a coat. It was a pharmacy issue coat, burgundy, with the shopper's logo on the chest and the left strip along the left sleeve that had been added to the design 3 years ago for visibility in parking lots. She kept it on the passenger seat of her truck on the way to and from work because the cab took 4 minutes to heat up and she needed it for those 4 minutes. She had kept it there every shift for 8 months, through October and November and December, and into January, The coldest January the lower St. Lawrence Valley had recorded in 11 years. The coat sat on the passenger seat the way some people keep a thermos of coffee or a bag on the seat beside the driver, not because there was a plan for it, but because it was the last thing she took off before she drove, and the first thing she reached for when she got out. On the morning of January 9th, she was driving east on Route 17 toward the pharmacy for the start of her shift. It was 6:47 in the morning. The temperature was -23, not counting the wind, the kind of cold that is not interesting because it is extreme. It is too common in this part of the country to be interesting. But that is worth noting because it describes the specific conditions under which everything that happened next would happen. She saw the man at the bus shelter on Industrial Boulevard at 6:52. He was not at the shelter. He was outside the shelter, standing at the edge of the sidewalk with one arm raised, not waving, just the arm of someone who is not certain the gesture is visible, but has decided it is the only gesture available. The shelter behind him had its glass panel missing on the north side, which meant the wind was coming through it directly, which meant the shelter was providing approximately the same protection as standing in the open air. He was wearing a work jacket, not a winter jacket. A work jacket, the kind with a thin quilted lining and a cotton outer shell, the kind that is sold in hardware stores and is adequate for October and insufficient for January. He was not young. She put him at 60 or older. He had a lunch bag in the other hand. She did not stop. She was on a scheduled shift. The pharmacy opened at 7, and the overnight staff was not supposed to leave until the morning crew arrived, which meant if she was late, there was a gap, and a gap at a pharmacy in a town. This size meant nobody was there for the people who arrived before 7:30 needing something they could not wait for. She passed him. She drove another 40 meters. She stopped the truck. She sat in the stopped truck for what was probably 11 seconds and felt like longer. She thought about the shift. She thought about the gap. She thought about the policy, which she had read once and did not particularly disagree with, and which described almost nothing that was actually happening on a given Tuesday morning at 6:52 in -23. She thought about her coat on the passenger seat. She put the truck in reverse. His name was Gilbert Audette. He was 63 years old, and he worked maintenance at the arena on Cachette Street, and the bus that was supposed to take him there had not come. Not because the bus was canceled. It was not canceled officially. The bus had broken down 2 stops back at Duplessis Avenue, and the backup vehicle was being dispatched, and the dispatch time was estimated at 40 minutes, and the updated arrival at his stop was therefore somewhere around 7:35. And his shift started at 7, and his supervisor had already written him up twice this winter for lateness, and a third write-up was a different kind of conversation. He had been standing outside the shelter for 19 minutes when the truck reversed toward him. He did not know the woman behind the wheel. He had seen her truck before, the burgundy pharmacy coat through the windshield, someone who clearly worked mornings somewhere. He had never learned her name. She got out of the truck without a jacket. She reached across the passenger seat. She came around the front of the truck and held the coat out to him. He said he was fine. She said it was -23. He said the bus was coming. She said she knew, and that he would need the coat while he waited for it, and that she had to get to work, but she would be at the pharmacy on Principale if he wanted to drop it off, and that if he did not drop it off, she was not going to worry about it. He took the coat. She got back in the truck. She was at the pharmacy at 7:02. The morning pharmacist, a young man named Etienne, who had started 3 months ago, and who Annette privately thought was going to be excellent once he learned to slow down, was already at the dispensing counter. She put her bag under the counter. She did not explain why she was cold. The coat arrived at the pharmacy counter at 11:47 that morning, carried by a woman Annette did not recognize, who introduced herself as Gilbert's daughter. Her name was Valerie. She was in her mid-30s, wearing a construction company logo on her fleece, and she had clearly come on her lunch break because she kept glancing at the door. She said her father had called her that morning from the arena. She said he had said a woman had given him her coat in the cold and had not asked for anything back, and that he had said it in the specific tone that her father used when he was describing something he did not have a category for. Annette took the coat. She thanked her. She started to turn back to the counter. Valerie asked her why she had done it. Annette thought about this for a moment. Then she said she had driven past him and turned around. She said she supposed she had not wanted to spend the rest of her shift knowing she had kept driving. Valerie looked at her. She said her father had told the whole crew at the arena and that 2 of them had cried, which was not, she said, the kind of thing that happened in the maintenance department at an arena on a Tuesday morning. Annette said she hoped he stayed warm. Valerie said thank you and left. Annette put the coat back on. She went back to work. The afternoon passed the way pharmacy afternoons pass in January. Steady, a little slower than December. People coming in for refills and for the things they had been putting off getting since before the holidays. She recognized most of them. She knew which ones would be short. She helped the ones who were. At 3:15, an older man came in for a blood pressure medication that the provincial formulary had delisted 3 weeks ago. The delisting meant his insurance no longer covered it. The cost without coverage was $94 for a 30-day supply. He stood at the counter holding his wallet open, as if looking at its contents might change them. He said he did not know what to do. Annette asked Etienne to step away from the counter for a moment. She looked at the man. She asked if he had a doctor he could call about switching to a formulary-covered equivalent. He said he had tried to get an appointment and had been told the next available was in 3 weeks. She pulled up the medication on the system. She found 2 covered alternatives that were therapeutically similar. She printed the information. She told him to call his doctor's office. Not to make an appointment, but to speak to the nurse and explain the situation, and to ask specifically about a prescription bridge while they sorted out the formulary issue, and that, if the nurse said there was nothing they could do, to call back, and she would help him figure out the next step. He said he did not know pharmacies did that. She said they did not always, but she had been here for 11 years and she had his file and she could make some calls if he needed her to. He thanked her. He left without paying for anything, which meant she had not solved the immediate problem, but she had given him a path through it, which was sometimes the more important thing. This was what Annette did. Not on the nights when the situation was clear and the solution was obvious. On the nights and the mornings and the long Tuesday afternoons when the situation was complicated, and the solution required someone to decide that it was their problem to help with. She had grown up in Trois Pistoles, the second of 4 children, in a house where her father, Romeo, had worked the same job at the same cooperative for 29 years and had been proud of it in the specific way that men of his generation were proud of things that lasted. The pride was not in the money, which was modest. It was in the continuity. In showing up, in being the person people could count on for 29 years, without having to think about whether you were going to show up. Romeo had a saying. He said it in French, and she had translated it for herself so many times that both versions lived in her head simultaneously. What it meant, roughly, was that you did not have to be the person who solved the problem. You just had to be the person who did not walk away from it. She had heard it so many times as a child that she had stopped hearing it as a sentence and started hearing it as her father's voice. The two became the same thing. She had married Maurice when she was 27. She had followed him to Rivière-du-Loup when he took the mill job, which had seemed at 27 like a reasonable bet on a stable future. It had been a reasonable bet. It had just not paid out in the way they had calculated. They had built something anyway. Not what they had planned. But something. José was the thing they were most proud of, though neither of them said this out loud, because saying it out loud felt like it was diminishing the other things. And it was not. It was just that watching a person you raised become the kind of person they became. Specifically, carefully. With their own choices and their own reasons. was a particular category of feeling that did not have a simple word for it. José was a pharmacist now, licensed, working at a clinic in Montreal that served a largely immigrant population on the plateau. She had called her mother the week of her licensing exam in a state of anxiety that Annette recognized as the anxiety of someone who was more prepared than they believed themselves to be. Annette had said, "You know what you know. You learned it. Go." She had gone. She had passed. She had called from outside the exam building, and Annette had been at the pharmacy counter at the time and had excused herself for 45 seconds to step into the supply room and hear about it without the counter between them. It was 12 days after the coat, on a Saturday afternoon in late January, that the call came from Valérie. Not from Gilbert. From his daughter. She called the pharmacy directly and asked for Annette by name. Annette took the call at the back counter. Valérie said her father had been telling the story since January 9th. She said it had moved through the arena staff and then through the network of people those staff members were connected to, which in a town of 20,000 is not a small network. She said her father had not described it as a remarkable act. He had described it as a simple act that nobody had ever done for him before, and the distinction between those two things was part of what had made it travel the way it did. She said there was a woman at her father's arena, an older woman who worked the skate rental desk, who had heard the story and had said she wanted to do something. Not for Annette specifically. For someone. She had gone home that evening and had taken a winter coat she never wore anymore out of the closet and had driven it to the women's shelter on Belanger Street. She said a man on the maintenance crew had heard the story and had remembered a neighbor of his, an elderly man who lived alone on his street, and who he had been meaning to check on since November, and had not. He had checked on him. The neighbor had not had a working smoke detector. The maintenance man had installed one. She said these were small things. Annette said yes. Valérie said her father wanted to know if it would be all right if he came in to say thank you himself. He had not come with her because he was working. Annette said of course. Gilbert came in on the following Wednesday at 4:15, near the end of Annette's shift. He was a large man, broader than she had registered at the bus shelter, with the specific posture of someone who had spent decades at physical work. Not stooped exactly, but organized around the expectation of weight. He was wearing a proper winter coat. She noticed the coat. He said thank you. He said it simply, without a speech around it. She said she was glad he had stayed warm. He said he had been thinking about why nobody had ever done that before. Not just for him. In general. He said he passed that shelter every morning and had been passing it for 4 winters, and every winter there were mornings like that morning, and he had never seen anyone stop before. Annette did not have a good answer for why people did not stop. She had some thoughts about it that she had accumulated over 11 years of overnight shifts, about the way that public space could create a kind of shared permission not to act, each person's inaction ratifying the inaction of the person next to them. But she did not say this to Gilbert, because what he was describing was not a sociology question. It was a person standing in the cold and nobody stopping, and the answer to that was not an explanation. The answer was to stop. He asked her if she would be willing to come and talk to his crew at the arena. Not a formal thing, he said quickly. Just to have a coffee. He said some of them had been talking after the story went around, and he thought there was something there, some interest in doing something they could not quite name yet. She said she would come. She went the following Friday morning before her shift and sat in the break room at the arena with 11 people who worked maintenance and skate rental and ice resurfacing and the canteen, and she drank coffee that was too strong and ate a store-bought croissant that was too soft, and she talked about nothing in particular for 30 minutes and then listened for 45. What she heard was not a plan. It was the shape of something that wanted to become a plan. People who had been watching the same problems for years without knowing what to do about them. The woman who worked mornings and who had been driving past the same bus shelter since 2019 and who felt, each time, exactly the way Annette had felt on January 9th. except that she had not turned the truck around. The man who had a cousin who drove a service van, and who had been thinking, in a vague way, that there must be something useful that could be done with an empty van on weekends. The teenager who worked the afternoon shift and who mentioned, almost as an aside, that 3 of her classmates did not come to school on cold mornings because the walk from their bus stop to the school was too far without proper gear, and their families did not have proper gear. None of these things were connected yet. They were just observations floating in a break room on a Friday morning, waiting for someone to notice that they were describing the same room from different angles. Annette pulled a notepad from her bag. She wrote down a name and a problem on each line, the way she had been writing down medication names and contraindications for 11 years. Not to memorize them, but because writing a thing down was the first step toward doing something with it. She wrote down the van, the bus shelter, the school walk, the woman at the skate desk who had coats in her closet she did not wear anymore and did not know where to bring. She said she did not know what to do with this list yet. She said she was a pharmacy assistant who worked nights, and that she was not a coordinator or an organizer, or someone who had done anything like this before. She said what she did know was that the list existed, and that a list of problems with names attached to them was better than a list without names, and that a list with names attached to people who wanted to do something about them was better still. The man with the cousin and the van said his cousin had a Saturday free in February. The woman with the coats said she had been meaning to call the shelter anyway. The teenager said she thought she could find out how many students were affected if someone told her it was worth finding out. Annette said it was worth finding out. She drove to the pharmacy after. She was 4 minutes early for her shift. She put her bag under the counter. She put the notepad in her bag. She thought about what her father had said. You do not have to be the person who solved it. You just have to be the person who did not walk away. She had not solved anything yet. She had a notepad and a list, and a break room full of people who were tired of walking past the same problems. That was not nothing. That was everything. That was where things started. 3 months later, the thing that did not have a name in the arena break room had a name. Valerie had suggested it at a kitchen table meeting in early March that had grown to 12 people, including Etienne from the pharmacy, who had turned out to have a public health background he had not mentioned, and a retired school board administrator named Pauline Desrochers, who had found out about the group through the woman at the skate desk and had shown up to the second meeting and not left. They called it arrêt, which meant stop in French, and which also meant deliberately the kind of stop you made when you saw something and decided it was your problem. The first month, they drove 11 people to medical appointments that they had been missing because the bus route did not reach the clinic and the taxi cost was $22 each way. They collected and distributed 43 winter items: coats, boots, gloves, through 3 drop points that Gilbert had arranged at the arena, the pharmacy, and a credit union branch whose manager had heard about the group from Valerie and had offered the lobby without being asked. The missed appointment rate at the community health clinic on Fraternité Avenue dropped in that first month by 17%. This was not a coincidence. It was a logistics problem that someone had finally treated as a logistics problem. Annette was not the director of Array. Pauline ran the coordination because Pauline had done it before and because Pauline did not require orientation. Annette drove when she could, before shifts and on her days off, and she kept a list of names and needs on the same notepad she had started at the arena, and she refilled it when the pages ran out. The coat still hung on a hook in her truck cab, not the pharmacy coat, which was back on her shoulders. A second hook, the kind you screwed into the cab wall above the rear window, that Maurice has installed in February with the tools he kept in the garage, the way he kept all his tools, organized and accounted for. Because tools did not leave, and a good coat hook did not care when you had finally found a use for it. She drove past the shelter on Industriel Boulevard every morning. The shelter still had the missing glass panel on the north side. They had filed a request with the Transit Authority in February. The Transit Authority had acknowledged the request. The glass had not arrived. Some things moved faster than others. The glass was the slow thing. The driving was the fast thing. The fast things happened while the slow things got sorted out. José came home for Easter and Annette told her about Array over dinner. Not the whole story, just the shape of it, the notepad and the break room and the van on Saturdays. José said she had been doing something similar at her clinic in Montreal, trying to connect patients with services they did not know they could access and could not get to, if they did know. Annette said she was not surprised. José said she said she had not thought of herself as someone who did that kind of thing. Annette said, "Who do you think taught you?" Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Maurice said the potatoes were getting cold and could they have this conversation in a direction that included eating. They ate. That evening, after Maurice had gone to bed and José was packing to leave the next morning, Annette sat at the kitchen table with the notepad, not writing anything. Just sitting with it the way you sit with something that has taken on more weight than it had when you bought it at the dollar store because it seemed useful to have around. She thought about Gilbert at the bus shelter. She thought about the 19 minutes he had been standing there before she reversed the truck. She thought about the 40 meters she had driven first. She did not consider herself brave for reversing. She considered herself lucky that the thing she had almost not done had turned out to matter so much. The difference between stopping and not stopping had been approximately 11 seconds of sitting in a parked truck in the cold. 11 seconds. She was not the kind of person who turned things into lessons, or who believed that every act of basic decency had to be explained in order to be useful. She did not have a speech prepared. She did not have a quote for the local paper, which had run a short item about Array in March and had asked her for a comment, and to whom she had said, simply, that people in Rivière-du-Loup already knew what needed doing. They just needed to know that someone else was willing to do it too. What she had was a notepad, a hook in the truck cab. A pharmacist's daughter in Montreal who did not realize how much of herself she had grown up watching. A husband who was more careful with his health now than he had been 4 years ago, which was the kind of change that happened quietly and did not announce itself. She had a coat on the passenger seat. She had a bus shelter on Industriel Boulevard with a missing glass panel that someone at the Transit Authority had promised to look into. She had 11 seconds that she had not thrown away. You do not have to fix everything. You just have to not drive past. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone in your life who might need to hear it. New stories every week, right here.